Democrats, they're worried that Clinton failed to make a forceful case for her candidacy. Since the convention, there's been nothing since the convention.
Folks, welcome inside the Parisi Palace, high above 2919 East Broadway. This is a special edition of the Jake Feinberg Show. Coming to you live on Power Talk. Please go to our website, powertalk.live. Download our free app and stream all of our live local programming, including the Jake Feinberg Show. We are full on extraterrestrial radio, streaming worldwide, and it is an honor to have you as part of the program today. Without further ado, I want to bring in a musician who's been playing music his whole career, spanning all genres and all styles, never being put inside a box. Everything from Mingus to Kerouac, and today in our short first set, we are going to be focusing specifically on his relationship and understanding of the genius known as Stan Getz. David Amram, welcome to the Jake Feinberg Show.
Thank you, Jake, and to all your listeners, wonderful to know that you have something worthwhile listening to, such as radio, along with books, musical instruments, languages, great cooking, theater, and politics when they're practiced to serve people rather than people serving the politicians.
Well, let me.
Areas of expression are to uplift rather than to bring down. So I wanted to mention that I'm so happy to be able to speak about Stan and about music, so that hopefully people who love Stan's music will bypass all the negative stereotypes that are written about people who play jazz and that are written about Stan, and realize the important thing about him, as with any artist, is what they created and the work that they did to inspire other people, whether or not they're practitioners of that particular art, to try to do better themselves and to feel good about being alive.
Can you talk about, in your mind, what, if you could talk about the first time that you remember crossing paths with Stan Getz, and then secondly, how he was misinterpreted and because of his mood disorders and drug abuse, but and really just focus on what made it a magical connection and why you loved Stan.
Sure. Well, I think it's very easy to put people or categories that aren't in the top 40 for that week, that are not fashionable, that are not super commercially successful before they tank. If you're fortunate enough to escape total obscurity, which, as we know, is almost better than recognition, because once you get the recognition, suddenly people who were never interested in what you're doing try to join forces and tell you what you really should be if you would only do what they suggest, which, if you are unfortunate enough to do so, makes you end up as the assistant to the warden of what I call a penitentiary bad taste. So Stan, when he was in obscurity, was a terrifically talented musician that everyone appreciated because he had something special. He had a voice of his own. He said it best when he was interviewed once. He said, well, Stan, people say you're a knockoff of Lester Young and the earlier jazz players, and you don't play as with the complexity and brilliance and architectural genius of Charlie Parker and John Coltrane and 100 Miles and Dizzy and Monk and hundreds of other people. Stan said, all I can say is every note I've ever played, I really meant. And he used to say that, and this comes out in different ways and different chords. But he always said, every note I ever played, I really meant, which I guess is not great English structure, so that's been changed into I meant every note I played or something. But he said it the other way, which I kind of like more.
But why do you get off on that? Tell the audience why you appreciate that authenticity.
Because that's what we're all trying to do, to tell a story. Lester Young's famous comment, who of course was inspiration not only to Stan and Paul Cornichette, whom they called the vice pres. Lester Young was the president of beauty, or pres. All people who admired him knew the famous story when there's some terrific saxophone players said, "Prez, I want to play for you." Prez was Lester Young's nickname. And he said, certainly, because Lester Young was extremely kind to anybody and everybody. If they exhibited any sign of remote sincerity or basic good manners on any level, he said, please. So the saxophone player got out of saxophone, played this incredible avalanche of hot licks, notes, the bombing of Hiroshima, the flight of the bumblebee, giant steps 3 times faster than anybody in history. And Lester Young just sat there. And then the saxophone player finally stopped and looked imploringly at Lester Young. And Lester Young said, "That was most impressive." He said, "Now I'd like to hear your story." And when I was a kid in Washington in the 1940s, living in what they called the Checkerboard Neighborhood, where black and white folks lived together, even though that was during segregation, we still all found a way to hang out together. And I would be lucky enough to play with some of the old masters as a teenage kid trying to play. I would hear, when I was struggling along, "Tell your story, tell your story." The whole idea was to be part of the whole, to make a contribution when you were invited, to even get to play, to be respectful. And when you did have a chance, not just to copy what you heard on someone else's record, but to play what you have to say, to tell your story. And Stan's playing was all about that. And when he came along, he became well known at a time when most of the giants of jazz and the pioneers were playing so sophisticated and so complicated harmonically, musically, that today, 60 plus years later, young people are studying what Dizzy Gillespie, Charlie Parker, Thelonious Monk, Kenny Clark, Bud Powell, and an army of other people I could mention nonstop. They're great pianists, Al Haig, Duke Jordan. There's so many people. I could spend your whole program just naming terrific musicians some of your audience would have heard of, and some they wouldn't have, that I was lucky enough to bump into. And the few remaining old-timers still bumping into them, and they're still playing this fantastic, brilliant music. Stan heard all that, and he loved it, but his voice and his story was to play what he felt he could do at the moment and honestly do to create his story at the moment. And he happened to use a language that was simpler, but just as sophisticated in the way that he did it.
Can you
because sophistication doesn't mean necessarily being complicated or difficult. It just means doing it, making it appear to be effortless, touching other people's hearts, and doing something that's memorable. And I remember when I was in Europe in the Army, I was with the 7th Army Symphony way back 1953, 54, and I would go to the famous Jazz Keller in Frankfurt whenever I had time off from playing with the symphony to play jazz, because I was a jazz French horn player when that was really considered to be impossible. And people said, we love Stan Getz. They always said, we can feel him. A young woman came up, I remember, and said, every time it's a rainy day, I could hear Stan playing in my mind, because he just has something that's so melancholy and beautiful and touching that it just stays with me. And that's something that you can't put in a book. You can't merchandise, but it's there. And it's that voice, it's that story. And he was able to tell that story. And I met him first, I believe it was 1951, possibly early 1952, because I went in the Army in August 52. I believe it was either the fall of 51 or the spring of 52. I'm not positive. And he was playing, he had Duke Jordan playing piano, Jimmy Rainey playing guitar. I believe Phil Brown was the drummer. I'm not positive. And I don't remember who the bass player was. And he was fantastic. We were playing it. He was playing at this little place I went, and I spent a lot of time with Duke Jordan, who was such a fabulous, amazing player.
Mm-hmm.
You could hear him not only with Stan, but when he played with Charlie Parker, and he was one of the great, great piano players of that time. And he could do all that difficult, complicated stuff, and loved doing it. He's on some of Charlie Parker's records, and his playing is superlative. And he also loved playing with Stan, because Stan also came from a deep place and deep feelings. And since I was, and I'm basically still at this moment, essentially what you call, I guess, a classical composer who uses all the experiences that I have, the ones I'm going to have this week as we speak, when Jadis Ian, the great songwriter, plays with me tomorrow night at the Stella Adler School for Acting, and when I play with Willie Nelson on Saturday night for Farm Aid. I use all those experiences of playing with people who are telling their stories in their way, with their voice and their style. So when I'm sitting down writing a chamber music piece, which I'm doing now, I can figure out which notes feel meaningful, and which ones don't. So essentially, with all the knowledge that I've acquired from writing over 100 symphonies and concertos and pieces, I use the feeling to be my own editor. I can't do that with something I played because I already did it. It's too late to change it, unless you say take two. But when you're composing, if your music is going to make anybody else feel anything, you have to feel it first. To keep that feeling sharp, it's great to be with other people, not only in music, but in anything, who operate essentially on their instinct, which is sharpened by feeling what seems to be for real and what is not for real. And usually if you're with outstanding people, that helps to keep you in tune. I hope that doesn't sound too highfalutin.
No, David, you're waxing poetic on Power Talk. We're talking to David Amram here, who
okay.
We're talking about Stan Getz, who is a melodic genius. He's performing with Janice Ian tomorrow, Farm Aid with Willie Nelson on Saturday, and we're going to probably do about 5 hours of interviews with David. But I wanted to talk to you about the idea of, I've interviewed probably 36 or more cats about Stan. He was on the road with Tea Garden in 9th grade, 15 years old. It really fucked him up. He learned how to drink. The four brothers were doing smack. I just want you talking about Stan telling his story the best you can. What you knew of Stan. What was he crying out for? What was that plaintive gypsy Jewish wailing coming from? Where did it come from? Where did the insecurity come from? Where did the pain come from? Because the guy didn't even know where his sound came from.
Well, I think he had a natural gift. And a lot of people have the natural gifts, and they either lose it or get discouraged, or their career counselors tell them to pack it in, and against their will, they do something else and forget about what it is that they originally felt somehow that they were put here to do. And in some way, thank heavens, Stan never forgot that inner voice that he had. And when I met him in Washington, we were hanging out at this little dinky place he was playing, and he knew I also wanted to write symphony music. He recounted to me how he had studied bassoon with Simon Kovar, a great bassoon teacher. Now, Ken Pasmanik, who was the first bassoonist in the National Symphony Orchestra in Washington in 1951, also had a jazz group that I made with him and a guy named Spencer Sinatra, who played with Stan Kenton's band and also tenor sax, and also played flute and piccolo with the Baltimore Symphony and the National Symphony. We had a group way back then, and I spoke to Kenny and I said, Ken, Stan Getz studied with the same teacher you did. And Ken said, I remember little Stan. He said he used to sometimes have his lesson on bassoon with Simon Kovar before me, And he was so musical, even though he got a weird sound, that Simon Kovar told him he should stop practicing the saxophone so much and concentrate on the bassoon. And Ken said you could hear him when he was taking his lesson. He had a special feeling, a special sound, and I always remembered his name. And then when he became well known as a jazz player, I realized that was the same Stan Getz who had studied as a kid with my teacher, Simon Kovar. Ken went on to be one of the best bassoon players in the world. I wrote a concerto for him that he played. And when Charlie Parker came to my basement apartment in 1952, Kenny was playing bassoon when we played for Charlie Parker for our little group. We'd all jammed together. Anyway,
wow.
Stan came out of that classical experience still realizing that he had something else that he really wanted to do. And somehow he managed to do it. As far as drugs, drinking, and all that stuff, we were surrounded by that. Now, today, 2016, quite a few weeks later, the whole country is addicted either to fructose syrup or, when that was outlawed, whatever slop they put in our food now to addict us in junk food, to going back and getting more, getting diabetes, being overweight, always being hungry, and being sick. We have fast foods that addict a whole population to bad nutrition. In addition to alcoholism and hard drugs, we also have all kinds of other things that doctors prescribe that are supposed to ease your mental pain, and all the things like Oxycontin and amphetamines for people who feel they get more energy if they get strung out on that. All the poisons and garbage that we ingest are part of the whole culture, so that it's very easy to relate to someone who did something extraordinary and see if they were addicted to something and use that as a definition of who they were and what they had to offer. Well, Ulysses Grant was an alcoholic, but we don't remember him as a famous drunk. Abraham Lincoln had all kinds of melancholy and psychiatric problems. We don't remember him as a great neurotic. We don't remember Sigmund Freud as a coke addict, because he was a big coke snorter in the days when that was supposed to be legitimate. And at the time, he and other people thought that was the path to nirvana. Our whole history is full of people of distinction who messed up in their private life or their health. When I was with Charlie Parker way back in 1952, it was the first time I ever heard the expression, "Do as I say, don't do as I do." And all those people, when I was surrounded with that, and they saw, I might appear to be nuts, but I wasn't strung out on anything. They said, "Stay clean," as they were snorting, shooting up, drinking, etc. And there was a certain morality in that whole community that if you didn't do that, you were better off, and you shouldn't do that. And I mention that because in the 1960s, drugs became institutionalized as a pathetic version of being what was supposed to be hip. And of course, Charlie Parker, way before Huey Lewis wrote that song, said to me, the hippest thing is to be a square.
I mean, to me, yeah, no, I mean, that to me is like, I don't know. It's not condescending. It's just, I don't buy. I mean, to me, it's like, Parker was a junkie. Go ahead. You were about to riff on Stan. Stan,
Charlie Parker was a musical genius who inspired and still inspires people all around the world who happened to have an illness, which addiction is, to something that eventually helped to cause his death. Just as Jack Kerouac died at the age of 47, drinking himself to death. However, hopefully, and fortunately, they are not remembered today for those self-destructive habits that killed them, but rather for, in spite of that, what they did that was so beautiful that it's lasted. And I mention that because regardless of what Stan did in his personal life, because if you go to a police lineup and they're trying to find a guilty person, 80% of the people in that lineup had a traffic ticket or beat up their girlfriend or had their girlfriend or boyfriend beat them up or whatever, or did something that was wrong as part of their life history. So if they're lucky enough to be not to be identified as that particular criminal, they don't have to carry that around with them with a big sign around them for the rest of their life, like the Scarlet Letter. And Stan did use drugs, and it was tragic that he did that. And he tried not to do it. And at the very end, the last few years of his life, I believe, had it pretty much beaten. But by that time, all those poisons that he put in the system beat him, and he left us way too early.
David, can you talk about the idea, like going back to 52, you said it was all around you. And I remember even reading a book about Stan where he said that if you weren't on junk, then you weren't trusted. And, was that the culture of the beboppers in the sense that, I mean, Dizzy smoked a lot of weed. He wasn't a junkie. But, everybody was the Four Brothers are a perfect example. Those guys were lit out of their minds. I mean, was that part of the culture of jazz? And the other thing about Stan was that he could be totally out of his mind and go, and you'd never know it because he'd go up on the bandstand and just play this incredible. I mean, the sound was just, the time feel was incredible. He was totally at perfect pitch. So I guess it's a dual question: was it a club? And then the second thing, if you could talk about Stan, how handsome he was, and then his ability to play these romantic ballads and also the ability to burn, so that he would bring people like Woody Herman would point to him and he'd be the lead soloist because he really knew, like you said, you tell a story, you bring people to you. And I wanted you to riff on those things for a minute.
Yeah, well, as far as the club went, if you go into any bar, which I'm 85, so I've certainly gone into enough bars, and after my 200th friend died, either from drinking or drugs, suddenly occurred to me, maybe that stuff ain't good for you. So that was my 12-step program, was having most of my friends die young, and heroes as well as personal friends often. And when my first child was born, and I was already 48 years old by then, and I saw that beautiful baby, I said, man, I want to be around when she grows up. The second child showed up. I said, oh, man, I got to be there for her. Then my son, Adam, came, and I was already 53 years old. I said, I've got to be there and play baseball with him and hang out, which I'm doing now, and now he's 31. And so that was my 12-step program, having my children on top of my friends dying. Some people weren't that lucky. And I only mention that because part of my job is when I go to schools and colleges and places, I talk about people like Stan and Chet Baker and Charlie Parker and Jack Kerouac and the painters Jackson Pollock and Franz Klein and all these people whom I knew who literally did themselves in by Dr. Kevorkian themselves with either drugs or alcohol. Part of the gig is not to dwell on that and romanticize that idea that to live fast and die young was some kind of a moral imperative or something that you had to do or that you were obliged to do if you wanted to be an artist. Just that was a sickness. And if you're really into music, you'll go out of that bandstand and die on the bandstand. As we speak, Hillary Clinton had pneumonia, but she had to go out and do her gig. So when she made her appearance and fell down at that ceremony, she didn't want to miss that. And even though her doctor said, you better cool it, she decided she was going to do it anyway because she was committed. And I commend her for that. I'm not particularly into politics, and she's not one of my heroes, but I do admire the fact that she showed up for the gig, and all musicians do that. And if you're around, as Stan was, people who were abusing drugs all the time, and you're a young, impressionable person, what they say to you, especially the drug dealers, is the same thing that the guys who waited at bus stations in New York City with what was known as the Minnesota Strip, where young women from Minnesota and that part of the country would come in on a Greyhound bus to become a famous actress or movie star or something. And the purveyor, or what's known as a pimp, would be at the bus station and say, "Baby, I can make you a star." And they would take you under their wing, and then after they were useless, be thrown in the gutter or replaced by someone else in the Minnesota Strip. Now, that type of community, if you want to call it that, and I knew guys who did that for a living, and they had a certain code of ethics, and they often came, along with a lot of other people, to the jazz places. That was also the same type of thing, of brainwashing and exploiting people into becoming your mental slave. Or if they were a drug dealer, you were a customer and a mental slave. So a lot of people that felt insecure, which that's what life is all about, because it is insecure. Every second that you're here could be your last one. Once you understand that, you can deal with your insecurities when you realize that that's a normal way of feeling, but you just keep on trucking anyway. Now, Stan was so young when he was around that he got taken the other way before an older person could come and have his trust and tell him to keep on doing what he was doing and not do that. Now, there was no people on the jazz scene I can remember who were there as sort of like counselors or advisors, except some of the older people who've been through that, who saw, like in my case, that you had something, and that maybe if you could avoid doing that, you might eventually be able to develop it into something. The other thing was being such a good-looking guy, and that made it even more difficult because everybody took him under their wing as a young person. Women were flocking to him because he was so handsome and such a fine player. And a lot of the people in that scene were themselves part of that drug culture. And that's something that's always becomes an inside group. And frankly, with all due respect, is a real drag to be around.
Right. Can you talk about? I don't know what you're in. I don't know what you're.
And Stan would be the first person to tell you that.
Can you talk about? I mean, I just interviewed. I was in Queens this last week interviewing Seymour Red Press, who was in Benny Goodman's band and was a Broadway contractor for many years. Knew Stan growing up in the East Bronx, and the idea of this anguish and this need for perfection as a Jewish person at the time, escaping the horrors of Russia, coming to the United States, and having to be better than the Irish and the Italian and the Anglos. At that time, the Jews felt very threatened. It's far different today in our, in this construct that we live in. But do you feel like Stan wore that? I mean, did you wear that on your sleeve as well? Can you talk about that mix of Jewish immigration in the New York area and how that affected cats like Stan and yourself?
Well, I think every person with a Jewish background, especially in our era, since I was born in 1930, and we had people who escaped the Holocaust and even stayed at our farm before we moved to Washington. I was aware of that as a little boy and went to school in rural Pennsylvania before I moved to Washington, where I had to learn how to fight and was beaten up every day for being one of the only Jewish kid in the whole school during that time. So even though I loved living on the farm and loved being there, I knew that the USA was not only Mr. Rogers' neighborhood. then when we moved to Washington, D.C., in a segregated city, we lived in the Checkerboard Neighborhood, which was where black and white folks lived together during segregation. I was amazed to see how black people were treated. And when I would play with the black kids across the street, I would get all kinds of static from white grown-ups, and I couldn't understand that. And finally, I said to my father, I said, I knew that people hated Jews, but I didn't know they hated black people too. Wow. Years later, when I worked with Jack Kerouac, and he would go to these parties with a gigantic cross on it, people would look at him like he was wearing a swastika at these big literary salons full of liberal, educated, intelligent, supposedly humanistic people, and they would look repulsed. I said, Jack, what is that? He said, well, they think we're low-class, blue-collar trash if we are observant Catholic. I said, are you kidding? I said, I knew they hated Jews. I knew they hated black people, but I didn't know they hated Catholics. He said, yeah. He said, we were considered in some circles to be at the bottom of the barrel. So essentially, every single person has some kind of horror story in their memory bank. And if you've been in the United States long enough, which was a place of refuge for people who usually had to come here to get out of the horrors of the scene, or were thrown out of the scene where the horrors occurred and came here, and you've been here a few generations, you're trained with those magic words, tone down your ethnicity. Now, when you travel all around the world and you see the places where all the people came from who were considered to be second-class ethnics, and ethnic is the code word for subhuman, you realize that everybody is a foreigner. Everybody is an ethnic person, and that every ethnicity and every person is sacred in terms of what their heritage provides them with their identity and their story. And if you could celebrate what your heritage is, what your parents and grandparents and great-grandparents were and went through to make it possible for you to live in this beautiful place and be just as American a citizen as the people who came over in the Mayflower, and more important, way more important than all of that, most important, I hope I'm stressing that point for your listeners, most important of all, that the people who have been here 50,000 years, Native American people, thousands of different nations, when Columbus came over here and mistakenly thought he was an Indian, called them Indians, welcomed everybody. And all the Native American people I played with my whole life, I'm just plugging my phone out, I never had, 40 years I played with Floyd Red Crow Westerman, and they knew I wasn't Native American, and people who were playing thought maybe I was because I was playing with everybody. When they found out, when I made it clear that I wasn't, they would say, what is your ethnic background? I never had any Native American person ask me that. And I mention that because ethnicity, if you want to call it that, cultural heritage, is a beautiful, precious thing for everybody. And when you realize that every single person of every heritage has also gone through suffering and also has something very beautiful, and you could celebrate that rather than trying to be something that you're not, then you can appreciate every other person on the face of the earth and their ethnicity and their heritage and respect it and feel at home with it. So if you're playing jazz, which was essentially, and it was an African-American art form, and you can do it from the heart and do it as respectfully as if you're trying to play Mozart or Beethoven or Bach or act in Shakespeare, you're on the case and you spend your whole life trying to learn how to do that. You don't go to a pawn shop, buy a violin, and then say, I'm going to play the Beethoven Violin Concerto with the New York Philharmonic next week because I own a beautiful set of black suit with tails and a white bow tie, and I can impersonate Jascha Heifetz or some great violinist. You spend your whole life learning how to do that. And it's the same thing with jazz, with the blues, with Cajun, with folk music, with any kind of music, or any kind of art, or any kind of sport. It's a lifetime devotion. And Stan used to practice a whole lot. Sonny Rollins, you just interviewed recently, mentioned he practiced so much that he finally went out on the bridge because Lucille, his wife, said, man, we can't keep moving because the neighbors are complaining. Charlie Parker used to practice 12 hours a day until his mother at one point was forced to move. And I mention that because Stan really put in the hours learning how to play the horn and really took great care of the kind of reeds that he used and everything that he did. And his Jewish heritage was something that he carried with him. And the little discussions we had about that, we both shared that realization that we were part of something that was very old, very beautiful, very much under the radar, just as jazz was under the radar, because to the point that it was accepted, jazz and African-American art was accepted by the stereotypes. And the stereotypes not only demean those who are stereotyped, worse, they make people of that particular group feel that if they don't act like the stereotype, they're not authentic.
You're waxing poetic right now, Amram.
No, I'm not poetic. Jake, I'm not poetic. I'm telling you some real stuff.
No, I'm trying to digest
because this is the real deal. This isn't any kind of theory. This is the reality of what we dealt with and what people today still deal with, although they don't know that that's what they're dealing with because it's been assimilated and buried and franchised so that people sit around in these places with trying to get into some club where they're having the same type of electronic death beat that they use to torture Al-Qaeda prisoners. And they don't realize that that's something that is dissuading them from the reality of trying to face life by looking for the beauty part, which surrounds us if you're aware enough to pay attention to what's beautiful at the moment and what's beautiful every day. If you think about that rather than what you're supposed to do to fulfill the worst curse on humankind, which is to be fashionable. And that if you feel like an undesirable ethnic creep, you can assuage that sense of inferiority by buying some trash junk, eating some trash junk, listening to some trash junk music or some rotten TV show, and that if you're around that putrefaction, you'll feel better and be more attractive. When people learn to love themselves, their own ethnic heritage, then they can appreciate the beauty of everyone else's, and they can be happy, and they won't buy nearly as much stuff, and the whole consumer society would collapse, which it's doing to an extent because people now are hip enough not to buy a lot of crap in order to make themselves feel more worthy. And that's not poetic, man. That's the real deal.
I like how I know it's not a theory. I know it's real. It's just the way you can articulate it so well is really, really inspiring to me. In 3 minutes, as we wrap up part one here, and I'd like to see you about your schedule for next week because I want to just go off on Kerouac and your career. But in 3 minutes, what do you believe is the most important thing that you believe should come across in this Getz documentary? I mean, we're dealing with somebody who had 2 marriages, 5 children, was a heavy substance abuser, had a mood disorder that was never diagnosed. You knew him personally. The guy was a pop star. He knocked the Beatles off the pop charts in '65 as a jazz melodic improviser.
Yeah.
He was never satisfied like yourself. He never let the grass grow beneath his feet. But if there was a few things that what is the most important thing that should be conveyed in this film documentary on Stan Getz?
That regardless of all the setbacks in life, he remained true to what he felt he was put here to do. he was able, through nightmares as well as the good times, to always stay on track to tell his story and leave us with a personal, warm, heartfelt musical message, and make other people realize that sometimes simplicity is the most sophisticated and difficult level to arrive at. He was able to do that. He was the epitome of what Miles Davis said, which was, as you mature, you realize not which notes to play, but what not to play. Sometimes Stan's sense of subtlety and understatement was the greatest statement of all. Played from the heart, and that's what we feel and hear today.